Well, thank you, Senator, for being here today. We're so happy to have you.
Good to be back home.
So you were just saying that you flew here from Corpus Christi.
Right.
Okay, so, but you had a big role in the FAA Authorization Act, right? Which is to get this flight straight from DC to San Antonio. Could you talk to us about that?
And I took the first flight to DC, American Airlines, just a week or two ago now. That's something we've been working on for 20 years, and it was nice to finally get it done. I live in Austin now, and you can fly direct to DC from Austin or Houston or Dallas, and here we are in the 7th largest city in America, and we didn't have a direct flight, and it's Military City, USA. Didn't make any sense whatsoever. So I'm glad we finally were able to get it done.
How much of a difference do you think this is going to make to San Antonians and people in this area?
Well, it's an early flight. It's 6:35 a.m. So the mayor told me that that the good news is, that's the bad news. The good news is you can take that flight up and come back in the same day and still make a number of appointments in D.C. So obviously, I think there's a big federal connection with San Antonio, with all the military and the like. And so I think it'll be helpful, be easier for people to get back and forth, hopefully help bolster the economy. I think it will.
And the other thing is that you keep hearing statistics. The earlier a flight is, the less of a chance it is to be delayed.
Okay.
So that's good.
That's a good thing.
Good.
Okay.
Yes. So now let's talk fentanyl, maybe something that's not so happy. But you co-sponsored the HALT Fentanyl Act, which passed in a bipartisan way. Mm-hmm. It would permanently classify fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I drugs, which puts any drug that's fentanyl-like on par with other dangerous and deadly substances. Can you talk about that and why you felt so compelled as a senator of Texas to co-sponsor that bill?
Well, if you think about the deadly drugs that we're maybe most familiar with, things like cocaine and heroin and methamphetamine and the like, but fentanyl is has made a relatively recent appearance on the scene. It's made primarily from chemical precursors that come from China, goes to Mexico where they're formed into pills. It looks like a relatively innocuous pill like a Xanax or a Percocet, something like that, when in fact it's laced with fentanyl. It's so powerful, even in small doses, it will kill you. And so I've been to a number of high schools and been with grieving parents who lost their children because they were taking, like kids will do sometimes, something maybe you wish they wouldn't, but certainly nothing they thought would kill them. So I thought it was really important to permanently list. This is a Schedule I drug. That's the most dangerous category for illegal drugs. But so much of this has to do with public awareness. So families will talk about it. Schools can help our young people. Right now, it's the leading cause of death for people between the age of 18 and 45. It's terrible stuff.
And you, sir, you've been a district judge.
Yes.
And this is your 4th term in the Senate. So you've seen there's always something new that comes up, and obviously there was the crack epidemic in the 90s, but fentanyl is very, very different in terms of the wide scope and how it's affected. I'm sure that some of your friends' children have been affected by this.
Sadly, that's true. And the problem is it's so potent in such small doses that it's easier to transport. And as the DEA has told me, the Drug Enforcement Administration, that you don't have to grow a plant like a poppy or a cocoa plant in order to produce the drug. You just mix these chemicals and then use a industrial capacity pill press, and they can gin out hundreds of thousands of these pills and distribute them on the street. And it's particularly dangerous. And they can also tweak the chemical composition of this, maybe by adding other drugs to it, which are deadly as well. But of course, you never know really what you're getting if you're buying this from some dealer.
At the end of the day, what do you think this bill would accomplish?
Well, I think it sends an important signal, and it's also a predicate for law enforcement to be able to signal this is the deadly drug that it really is. But I think it's going to take a lot of different things to try to save lives. It's going to take parents being aware of this threat and talking to their children at the dinner table. It's going to take schools spreading the information among their peers at classes. and it's going to take law enforcement. But it's also going to take stricter border security measures, because we know where these chemicals come from, and we know how they get in the United States, and that's usually across the U.S.-Mexico border. So I think all those things will help bring those numbers down.
But the overdose deaths, right? That's a thing that's obviously concerning to most people. Nobody wants to lose their child or their loved one in this way. It's just horrific. But critics, some of your colleagues in the Senate who didn't vote for or didn't support this bill, say this does not do that. Senator Cory Booker says that this bill gives people false hope, and he said that it doesn't address the root cause and will make matters worse because it classifies some fentanyl copycat substances as Schedule I drugs when they could be used to fight overdoses or provide other medical treatments. That's his criticism.
Well, my friend Senator Booker from New Jersey doesn't believe in enforcement. He believes in treatment, and certainly that has its place, and there are other things that we need to do. Narcan is a commonly used antidote to fentanyl poisoning, and so as I indicated earlier, there's a lot of different things we can do, but this is really one of the foundational elements of trying to send the signal that, hey, this is serious stuff, and it's the most dangerous category of illegal drugs. So I told Senator Booker that I'm happy to work with him on other legislation, but let's get this permanently scheduled as a Schedule I drug, one of the most dangerous category now, and then we can work on some of these other things perhaps later.
So fentanyl legislation to be continued in
Yes.
the future. Okay. Now let's talk tax cuts. So we know that last month, House Republicans passed a budget resolution that would allow for $4.5 trillion in tax cuts over 10 years, $2 trillion in spending cuts. That's what they're proposing. But then you look at the debt, $36 trillion. So if we have $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, but $2 trillion in spending cuts, that doesn't seem like it's going to make a big dent.
It doesn't level out. It doesn't. Spending and debt don't even out to zero. Well, this is a chronic problem. As you point out, we have a mountain of debt. We've finally gotten to the point where we're spending more money on interest on the national debt than we are on defense, which is a very bad thing in a very dangerous world, the most dangerous since World War II. So I would call this a start. I've been in the Senate a long time, and cutting things is never popular, and so we tend to kick the can down the road, but we are literally running out of road because it's an unsustainable situation. So I think this is a start. Some of the things that Elon Musk is doing with the Department of Government Efficiency is highlighting some of the crazy spending that the federal government has done that most people kind of suspected was going on but never had been able to concretely identify. So I actually am pretty optimistic that we're going to be able to maybe make a down payment on some of the debt. And it's not going to be easy. The Senate's going to have to now match up our budget resolution with the House, and then comes the hard part. I said bad, but it's bad and hard. But it's good ultimately of finding those cuts. But all of the spending has a constituency of some kind. And so I'm sure it will be met with some controversy.
Well, that's it, right? Because spending is really bad when it's not in my district or for
Right.
my people, but when you're bringing those dollars home, it's pretty good. People like it.
I can't tell you how many people show up in my office and say, can we get some money from the federal government? And I'm happy to help meritorious projects. But as I indicated, there's a lot of spending that goes on in Washington. When you tell normal average people, this is how your tax dollars are being spent, they say that's crazy, and it is. So we need to get as much of that as we can out of the way, but then we need to be able to bend that debt curve, because we can't stay on this unsustainable path.
But when you look at spending, the meat and potatoes, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
Yep.
And the next question, whenever I speak to any politician, is like, yeah, but we don't want to touch that. What's your stance on that? Because we have to make big sacrifices, and you have big decisions to make.
Well, sometimes you need to pick your battles, and in Congress, when you're dealing with things like Social Security and Medicare, it needs to be bipartisan. And
You think that's going to happen?
no, I don't. Not now. It should. Back when Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, I realize that's a long time ago, did a bipartisan Social Security bill. you can do it that way, but the federal government spends about $6.7 trillion a year. So, and there's a lot of spending that isn't Medicare, isn't Social Security. It's under the category of mandatory spending programs, but there's still about $700 billion of non-Social Security, non-Medicare mandatory spending. To me, that's sort of the ripe target. But here's the problem. All of those spending programs have their own constituency. And so when you say, well, we're going to trim here, we're going to slow the rate of growth, then that's where you get some pushback. And that's just normal. But that's why Congress typically likes to do the easy stuff. But I think that's no longer tenable. So we're going to have to do some of the hard stuff here in the next few months.
And what hard stuff are you prepared to do?
Well, I'm prepared to cut spending, particularly on the mandatory spending side. Well, I'm not going to make that decision by myself. The budget framework you referred to gives us authority then to go back to the various congressional committees. For example, I'm on the Finance Committee. Part of what we're going to have to consider is extending the current tax provisions, which expire at the end of this year. If they do expire, 62% of taxpayers will pay more taxes. And that's always a concern, particularly coming off of 40-year high inflation. So I'm not going to be able to do it by myself, but I am willing to do things that maybe aren't all that popular by trying to find ways we can slow the rate of growth of spending and deal with some of these programs that I don't think are a priority. I think it's the same decisions you have to make in your own household. What are things you have to have? Food, shelter, clothing. What are the things you'd like to have that maybe you can budget for? And then what are the things that you want but you can't afford, at least not now, you maybe have to save for? So the federal government doesn't do that because it just prints money. And I think foolishly, let me use that word, continue to add to the debt. But I think those birds have now come home to roost, and we have no choice, in my view, but to deal with these hard issues.
But when you talk about the home, like the household budget analogy, then tax cuts would be taking in less revenue.
Right. It means
so how does that help?
Well, the federal government isn't exactly like your household, to be sure. But it's a helpful analogy, I think, in terms of prioritizing different things. The most important thing the federal government does is provide for national defense. That's the main job of the federal government. Everything else flows from that, because if we're not a safe and secure country, then nothing else really, you can't enjoy all the other things that people love and enjoy. So I think, how do we prioritize that? Right now, we spend 2.8% of our economy, gross domestic product, on defense. That's a low point in a world that's the most dangerous world since World War II. And we need to do more. We also need to modernize the military, and not only how much money you spend, but how the money is spent. How much you spent as well as how you spend it. So all these are met with problems and challenges, and that's the reason why many times people go to Congress and they don't do anything about it, because they want to do the easy stuff. I always say it's easier to eat your dessert first and not your vegetables.
Right, you got to eat the peas first.
Yeah, but we're going to have to eat our vegetables.
Okay, and you know, the other thing is, since you mentioned the military, the transgender ban, obviously you know that the judge shot down President Trump's plan to ban transgender members of the military. Can I get a comment on that?
Well, I don't think it's the final word.
He said he would appeal.
We have a lot of judges in America, and federal judges, and usually when somebody picks a judge and a jurisdiction to file a lawsuit, they have some indication maybe the judge might be sympathetic. But you've heard some talk about, well, we need to impeach judges that don't agree with our, with
As a former judge, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think that's not right. I think there is a way to deal with erroneous decisions by judges, and that's to appeal. And then ultimately get it to the Supreme Court of the United States. But I know the administration knew that there would be pushback on some of these policies. They knew there would be litigation, but then they wanted to test the limits of executive authority and particularly how our military operated. So I think it will run its course here in the next few months.
Okay, now I want to go back to the tax cuts because the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, when they analyzed extending the Trump tax cuts, they're saying that yes, all income groups would get a tax cut. That's a fact.
Yeah.
If the Trump cuts are extended, but then when it broke down the numbers, somebody making $1 million would get a $78,000 a year cut.
Yeah.
Someone making between 65 and 116K, which is probably more comparable to what people here in San Antonio are making, would get a $1,000 cut. Someone making under $50,000 would get a $273 cut.
Yeah.
Big disparity there.
Yeah, it's because we have a progressive tax code, and about half of taxpayers don't end up paying income tax. They pay other types of taxes. And the people you mentioned who are making a lot of money, they pay a higher percentage of their income because they make more. So it's all based on your percentage of income. And but I do agree with you that if we don't extend this, every tax bracket will experience a tax increase. Wall Street Journal said 62% of taxpayers will see a tax increase. On top of 40-year high inflation, which we've been through in the last few years, I think it's a bad idea. So I'm determined to try to do what we can not to raise taxes on our taxpayers.
Obviously, inflation affects everybody, but not equally. If you are, you're somebody who's making $1 million,
I agree with that.
It's not going to hit you. You're not going to feel it as much as as someone who's making $50,000 a year and who's really struggling to make ends meet.
No doubt about it.
Everything is more expensive.
No doubt about it.
So the criticism is that this would not necessarily benefit the middle class.
Well, that's not true. And of course, inflation does affect people on fixed income and people of modest resources the most, because there's no way they can they can absorb those costs. People who do make more money can deal with it, and I would say and they have. But I'm more concerned about the people on fixed income or modest income and seeing this basically invisible tax on their standard of living. But the tax code is, like I said, is progressive, and we've expanded the individual deduction, the child tax credit, and other things in 2017 when we last passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and those would go away unless extended. Small businesses who pay income tax on an individual tax return, so-called pass-through business entities, they would all end up paying more, which I think would have a negative effect on their business, their ability to hire people. So, like I said at the beginning, it's not going to be easy. There are going to be some hard choices to make. I'm sure some of it's going to be controversial, but that's the nature of the business.
What would you tell? The taxes are just one part of it. There's inflation, also tariff talk, that potentially, there's a lot of uncertainty that just when you talk to people, I mean, these are kitchen table issues.
Yep.
There's a lot of angst out there. Obviously, you working in DC, there is a little bit of a bubble there.
Mm-hmm.
How do you understand what people are going through? That uncertainty? How often is it that you speak with people who tell you, man, I'm not feeling certain about my future. I don't know if I'm going to be able to afford sending my kid away to school. I don't know if I'm going to be able to afford my rent.
Yeah, I know there is a lot of anxiety and uncertainty now. I've never known a time in my life where basically anything was certain, but yes, I agree that tariff talk, things like that, a new transition to a new administration, there's a lot of, there's some anxiety. Some of that I think is just how, the nature of our lot in lives with social media and things like that. It seems like, bad news and people stirring things up on social media, some of which are just plainly false. But I think we're in a transition. President Trump's been in office 2 months. It seems like longer because so much has been happening. But I think a lot of this will work itself out over time.
Do you think we're going to have a recession sometime?
I don't think so. Certainly not here in Texas. Of course, we'll continue to lead the nation when it comes to the economy. I was just out in the Permian Basin a couple days ago, and one of the things President Trump has called for is American energy dominance. And we are capable of producing incredible amounts of energy, enough to export it to our friends and allies around the world. That's good for the economy, keeping gasoline prices and home heating prices lower. I think that part is going to be really good, but we will. It's hard to predict. We'll know in retrospect how everything worked out, but I'm personally optimistic.
Okay, final section here that I want to get to, and that is the fact that you said that you want to run for re-election for potentially a 5th term in the Senate. The one name that keeps being brought up is Ken Paxton. He has said not so nice things about you. He said he's had his chance, he hasn't performed well, and the voters know it.
Well, there's a reason why I've been elected by large margins every time I've run for office. And that's because the 31 million people in Texas know me, and they know how I do my job, and I do my best to be responsive to their needs. But look, elections are all about competition. I'm not particularly concerned about that. If the time comes that this gentleman or anybody else decides to run, we'll be ready for that. And we'll take our case to the voters. There's something about running for election. You never feel kind of like more alive and more engaged because you're out there on your own. It's your reputation, it's your record, but you have a chance to be able to make the case to the voters. And so far, the voters have liked what they've seen.
Well, Ken Paxton is likely to get the endorsement of President Trump. I
don't think that's a given. Certainly, I know. I'm talking to President Trump. I worked with him for 4 years when I was the whip, this is chief vote counter. And well, that remains to be seen. He hasn't made any endorsements. He hadn't given any indication. And that certainly would be a factor. But I'm not exactly sure trading somebody who will spend the first year finding the bathrooms in the Senate office building, what sense that makes as compared to somebody who has a proven track record of being effective on behalf of the people of Texas. So I'm not particularly concerned about that, but we are getting prepared for that, and we'll see what President Trump decides to do. But I work for 31 million Texans, and those are the people I'm going to be talking to primarily.
Anything else that you want to tell us, sir?
We covered a lot.
We did. We did.
I think I'm fine. I'm good.
Okay. All right, Senator. Thank you so much
Thank
for being
you.
with us and sharing your perspective.
You bet.
Okay.